Well, thank you, and thanks for giving me the chance to speak to all of you today. You know, it's kind of a dark time for the European project. The European Monetary Union, which was supposed to bring your countries together, is instead tearing them apart and throwing millions into economic misery as a result. So, in this time of dark news, it's nice to be able to think about one of the great successes of that project, Europeana. For centuries, Europe was divided by some of the most vicious and violent wars unleashed by humanity. And now, thanks to you, it's unified by some of its greatest and most lasting cultural achievements. And so it's fitting that Europeana is itself developed in that sort of cooperative spirit, with the source code released under a free software license and made available on the web for anyone to use it or contribute to it. Note I use the term free software, not open source, because the free software movement is a moral crusade, not merely a technical choice. Perhaps I can best explain with a story. The free software movement started with a paper jam. It was 1980, and the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT had received an elegant new printer from Xerox. The printer, however, had an unfortunate tendency to jam. It caused print requests to pile up, and nothing could get printed until someone happened to notice and fix the jam. For Richard Stallman, one of the programmers at the AI lab, this wasn't such a big deal. With their previous printer, Stallman had just changed the printer software to detect whether the printer was jammed, and if it was, then it would notify anyone who was trying to print. If you got that message, you couldn't just assume somebody else would fix it, Stallman later recalled. You had to go to the printer. A minute or two after the printer got in trouble, the 2 or 3 people who got messages would arrive to try and fix it. And of those 2 or 3 people, one of them at least would usually know how to fix the problem. But you see, the Xerox printer was different. Xerox hadn't provided the lab with the source code to their printer drivers. There was no way for Stallman to add in this new feature. So instead, when the printer got jammed, it just piled up like it had before Stallman had done any of this work. When he asked Xerox for the code so that he could add in the feature he made, they refused to provide it. They insisted it was an important trade secret for their business. And when Stallman found a student at Carnegie Mellon, another university, who did have the software, that student refused to provide Stallman with a copy, saying he'd signed an agreement with Xerox not to share it with anyone. And Stallman was outraged. Computer software was supposed to be a tool to serve people. That's why he and his lab mates spent their time writing software. And yet, through a combination of greed and legal restrictions, actual people were forced to suffer because they were prevented from improving these tools. Now, maybe this was a small amount of suffering. It's a little annoying to not have your stuff be printed and have to go and fix it. But Stallman saw this as a symptom of a larger problem. He saw that software was going to become more and more a part of our lives, that it was going to get into everything, and that those programs would control large portions of our day, that those little frustrations, like the printer jam not being able to be fixed, piled up and caused problems for real people in their real lives. Realizing that, Stallman wanted to make sure no one else would suffer the way he was suffering. He wanted to build a computer system around principles of freedom. So in 1984, he quit his job and announced the GNU project, a project dedicated to building an operating system entirely out of free software. Stallman later explained that free software was software that guaranteed users 4 freedoms. It wasn't software that was available for no price. It wasn't free as in beer. It was free as in freedom. And free software had 4 basic freedoms. The first was the freedom to run the program for any purpose. The second was the freedom to study how the program works and adapt it to your needs. And source code was naturally a requirement for this freedom. Without the source code, you couldn't really understand how the program worked, and you couldn't really adapt it. The third freedom was the freedom to redistribute copies so that you could help your neighbor. And the fourth freedom is the freedom to improve the program and to release your improvements to the public so that the whole community could benefit from the work you did. In the United States, and I expect it's much the same in Europe, most libraries are managed by software that is not free. When you look up books in their electronic card catalog or check out discs at their circulation desk, you use software that's sold by commercial companies for expensive fees, where the source code isn't available and new features can't be added by the users. But again, in the spirit of Stallman, a few bold libraries have banded together. Instead of giving more and more public money to private corporations, they've spent their resources supporting free software versions of this. At first, their software didn't have as many features as the proprietary ones, but over time it's grown better and better, and soon it will no doubt have more features than any proprietary option. Europeana has done so much already, but if you're looking for future directions, I hope that you can bring this model to Europe. As more and more research moves online, as kids realize that the first place to go is not the library, but Google, people are going to find out about library items, not by making a conscious choice to trundle down to their local library or to go even to a library's website and look things up in a card catalog, but instead by using general tools to search the entire web, among which library items will be just one of many different kinds of results. This means that every library must adopt the principles of collaboration and open data that Europeana has embraced, and you are well positioned to provide them with the free software to do just that. I encourage you to expand Europeana to not just include an index of the digitized works of Europe's museums, but all the works of all the continent's libraries. To not just provide a search through these things to people on the internet, but to provide the software that manages and organizes these libraries for all their real-life patrons. And to do it not just for Europe, but for the entire world, to bring that great cultural contributions of humanity as first-class status on the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web itself is one of the great achievements of Europe. Developed in 1990 by Tim Berners-Lee, an Englishman living in France who worked at a lab in Switzerland, it was quite consciously invented with the notion of tying the world's documents together. In a proposal to his bosses, he was talking about the problems of keeping information together at his physics lab in CERN. But his words can be read as applying to all of humanity. Here's a quote from his original 1990 proposal, asking his bosses for some money that he could use to create what he called World Wide Web. He wrote, "Information is constantly being lost. The introduction of new people demands a fair amount of their time and that of others before they have any idea what's going on. The technical details of past projects are sometimes lost forever or only recovered after a detective investigation in an emergency. Often, the information has been recorded. It just cannot be found." He was talking about the problems in his physics lab, but I think his words ring true for us as a society, for us as a culture, for us as a planet. Today, the web has in some ways proved an even greater solution to this problem than he possibly could have imagined in 1990. But in other ways as a culture, we still have a long way to go. Tim sometimes likes to joke that if it's not on the web, it doesn't exist. But for many people, this is becoming a reality. And rather than something to be deplored, I think it's one of the great, exciting moments for humanity. Before, access to knowledge was something restricted by wealth and geography. Precious few could camp out in the British Library to get the benefit of its accumulated wisdom. But now, even the poorest people on the planet can visit any web page from their cell phone. There's sometimes talk of a digital divide, the notion that putting things online only benefits the wealthy elite who have high-speed internet access. It's sometimes suggested this is a reason to push for things to be available offline, as well as on the internet. But you know, there are billions of people around the world clamoring for internet access, with thousands of very well-funded companies working hard to bring it to them. Even the greatest offline-only collection is never going to have that kind of distribution behind it. So if we do want to make things available to as many people as possible, the solution is to put a record of it on the web. Perhaps that record leads to another site or someplace offline, as many pages on Europeana and my own open library do now. But it puts down a marker. It says, here's what we know. Assembling that great card catalog in the sky is the task of our generation. I'm glad to see you've made so much progress, and I wish you the best of luck in the future. Thanks.
Okay,